By December 1944, the Pacific War had reached a stage of profound asymmetry between the naval forces of the United States and the rapidly deteriorating Imperial Japanese Navy. The strategic landscape that shaped the encounter between USS Bergall, IJN Myōkō, and IJN Ushio was the product of years of attrition, logistical strain, and the cumulative effect of decisive U.S. offensives. Understanding the circumstances that brought these three ships into contact requires examining the broader framework of operations in the South China Sea region during the final phase of the war. The collapse of Japan's naval power was not the result of a sudden event, but the outcome of a long process in which every remaining major warship was increasingly isolated, undersupplied, and operating far from adequate repair bases. By late 1944, even experienced, heavily armed cruisers such as Myōkō struggled simply to move between ports without facing overwhelming danger. The greatest catalyst for Japan's accelerating naval decline in this period was the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944, which resulted in devastating losses to surface combatants, aircraft carriers, and trained personnel. Several of the surviving Japanese cruisers and destroyers that withdrew from the battle were heavily damaged, including Myōkō. The loss of fuel supplies across the Japanese Empire meant that warships often had to operate on minimal reserves or rely on makeshift repairs that could not restore them to their proper combat capabilities. Japan's ability to defend its shipping lanes was also collapsing under relentless U.S. submarine pressure. American submarines operating from Fremantle and Pearl Harbor were sinking cargo ships, tankers, troop transports, and warships at a rate Japan could no longer absorb. These submarines operated aggressively along the Indochina coastline, the Gulf of Siam, the Java Sea, and the South China Sea. The U.S. Navy's submarine campaign, though sometimes overlooked in popular narratives, was one of the fundamental reasons behind the erosion of Japanese maritime strength. USS Bergall, the submarine that would eventually cross paths with Myōkō and Ushio, was part of this expanding submarine presence. Bergall was a Baleo-class submarine, one of the most advanced and reliable classes produced by the United States during the war. Commissioned in June 1944, she was relatively new to wartime operations, but had already demonstrated effectiveness during her first patrol. Under the command of Commander John M. Hyde, Bergall earned a reputation for aggressive yet calculated attacks and for maintaining discipline under hazardous circumstances. Hyde himself was an experienced submariner, with service as executive officer on USS Swordfish earlier in the war. His familiarity with submarine operations in contested waters made him a capable commander, especially given the balancing act between offensive patrol duties and mine-laying assignments that were part of this particular patrol. Bergall sailed from Fremantle on 5th December 1944 with orders to patrol the Indochina coast and lay naval mines near a navigational feature known as Royalist Bank. Because the aft torpedo tubes were required to carry mines, the submarine could only employ her forward tubes if she encountered enemy warships while patrolling the area. This was a significant operational limitation, since most American submarines relied on the ability to attack from either direction, depending on relative positioning. Nevertheless, mine-laying operations were considered essential to choking off remaining Japanese coastal shipping routes, especially those connecting Singapore, French Indochina, and the Philippines. Bergall's assignment placed her directly on a pathway that Japanese naval units fleeing Singapore or attempting northbound transits might use, and this geographic reality was the central factor that made the eventual encounter possible. At the same time Bergall was moving toward her patrol area, the heavy cruiser Myōkō was facing her own crisis. Before the war began, Myōkō had been one of Japan's most formidable cruisers. As the lead ship of her class, she represented Japan's interpretation of the Washington Naval Treaty limitations, though later modifications placed her above the treaty displacement caps. Myōkō was heavily armed, fast in her original configuration, and well suited to long-range operations. She fought extensively in the early and middle periods of the Pacific conflict, seeing action in the Philippines, the Netherlands East Indies, the Battle of the Java Sea, the Battle of the Coral Sea, and the Guadalcanal campaign. Over time, however, repeated combat operations and wartime shortages led to incremental losses in her operational efficiency, culminating in the serious damage she suffered during the Battle of the Sibuyan Sea. The torpedo strike from a U.S. carrier-based aircraft devastated her stern, knocked out her starboard shafts, and left her unable to maintain fleet speed. After struggling to withdraw from the Philippines, she managed to reach Singapore on 3 November 1944. Singapore was one of Japan's largest anchorages in Southeast Asia, but by late 1944, its repair capabilities had diminished drastically due to material shortages and repeated Allied air raids. Japanese engineers assessed Myōkō's damage and concluded that complete repairs were impossible. Only limited temporary repairs could be made, most of them aimed at improving stability, restoring partial power, and reducing flooding risk. The intention was never to make Myōkō combat capable again in Singapore. Instead, the ship was to be sent back to the home islands for comprehensive repair work. This decision reflected the broader strategic desperation of the Japanese Navy, which could not afford to abandon a major vessel even when severely crippled. Orders eventually came to prepare Myōkō for the trip north, a journey that would require her to pass through waters increasingly dominated by Allied submarines. The destroyer Ushio, one of the older Fubuki-class destroyers, joined Myōkō as her escort. Ushio had survived numerous engagements throughout the war, including the attack on Pearl Harbor, but by November 1944, she too was in poor condition. Damage sustained near Manila had disabled one of her engines and killed more than 20 crew members. Her top speed was significantly reduced, limiting her usefulness in any high-speed maneuvering that might be necessary if the formation encountered American submarines. Nevertheless, she was one of the only destroyers available in the region, and so she was assigned to escort the damaged cruiser. Both ships were in compromised condition, suffering from mechanical limitations, shortages of parts, and reduced performance. Their delayed departure from Singapore on 12 December 1944, caused by preparation issues and the difficulties of preparing two damaged vessels for a long voyage, placed them on a direct path toward Bergall's patrol sector. The movements of these three ships, Bergall approaching Royalist Bank from the south, and Myōkō and Ushio moving northward along the Indochina coast, were entirely independent of one another, yet intersected through circumstance. Neither side had prior knowledge of the other's exact location. Bergall's orders were based on predicted traffic patterns, not intelligence suggesting a major cruiser was heading through the area. Likewise, Japanese planners did not anticipate the presence of a U.S. submarine immediately off the coastal approaches. The encounter that resulted on the evening of 13 December was therefore not the consequence of a planned interception, but an accidental convergence in a theater increasingly crowded with American submarines and increasingly traversed by damaged Japanese ships attempting to flee to safer ports. The events of the late afternoon and evening of 13 December 1944 unfolded as a direct consequence of the strategic conditions described earlier, but the specific interaction between USS Bergall and the Japanese formation resulted from a series of tactical decisions made under considerable uncertainty. Commander John M. Hyde brought Bergall into the vicinity of Royal Bank shortly before dusk. The plan was to lay mines after nightfall, taking advantage of the darkness to avoid detection by aircraft or coastal observers. The weather was unusually favorable for such operations. The sea was calm, the sky was clear, and the moon had not yet risen, leaving only starlight to illuminate the surface. These conditions reduced the visual signature of a surfaced submarine, but at the same time increased the difficulty of identifying distant contacts. It was during this period of relative quiet that Bergall's radio intercept equipment detected an unusually strong signal. American submarines often employed radio direction finding to identify the presence of large enemy vessels. Powerful transmitters typically signaled the movement of major combatants or command ships. The strength of the signal, combined with its bearing, suggested that a large Japanese vessel might be operating nearby. Hyde could not determine the exact nature of the contact at this stage, but the possibility that a significant surface ship was in the area prompted heightened alert among the crew. Bergall began to steer toward the general direction of the signal in order to investigate further. Shortly before 1800, lookouts on Bergall reported sighting the mast of a vessel on the horizon. Because of the distance, the contact appeared only as a faint, vertical line silhouetted against the dim skies. Hyde immediately recognized that this was not a merchant ship. The height of the mast and the scale of the superstructure beneath it indicated the presence of a large warship. He also understood that the ship was on a northbound trajectory, heading along a coastal lane that Japanese vessels used when traveling between Singapore and the South China Sea. To intercept or overtake this vessel, Bergall would have to maneuver rapidly, but this introduced complications. The submarine suffered from vibration when running at high speed, making it difficult to maintain top performance without risking equipment strain. Even at maximum speed, Hyde judged that Bergall could close the distance but might not be able to overtake the target in time to execute a submerged attack. This assessment was based on the fact that the Japanese vessel, whatever its identity, was moving toward an area of shallower depth. A submerged submarine needs sufficient depth and maneuvering room to approach undetected. If Bergall attempted to get ahead of the target by tracing a wide arc while submerged, the vessel might reach shallow waters before the submarine could line up for an attack. This left Hyde with an unusual set of choices: abandon the attack entirely, wait for the ship to pass and risk losing contact, or conduct a surface approach. The latter option was inherently risky, especially against what appeared to be a major combatant, but Hyde concluded that the weather and darkness provided enough concealment to justify the attempt. As Bergall approached, radar data provided additional clarity. A second, smaller contact soon appeared on the radar scope, consistent with an escorting destroyer. The configuration, a large vessel accompanied closely by a smaller one, indicated that this was a Japanese naval unit of importance rather than a transport convoy. At this stage, Hyde still did not know the precise identity of the vessels. The American submarine force did not have immediate intelligence information suggesting that the damaged Myōkō was attempting a transit from Singapore. Given the limited speed of the formation, Hyde might have interpreted the contact as a cruiser accompanied by a destroyer patrolling or relocating within the region, perhaps even an undamaged and fully combat-capable one. This uncertainty underscored the danger of proceeding with a surface attack, as a submarine caught on the surface by alert enemy warships was extremely vulnerable. Nonetheless, Hyde continued closing the range. The calmness of the sea, though tactically helpful in terms of concealment, also presented a problem. Smooth water reflected light more effectively, and any significant silhouette or wake could reveal Bergall's presence. Hyde noted in later reports that the brightness of the starlit sky caused concern, as reflections from the submarine's hull might give away her position. Even so, the darkness was sufficient to keep Bergall unobserved during the approach. As the distance closed to around 9,000 yards, visual details became clearer. The large vessel's forward structure became extinguishable, and the size suggested a heavy cruiser, though identification to a specific class remained uncertain. Hyde recorded the impression that the vessel was significantly larger than a light cruiser, which reinforced the belief that he was approaching a high-value target. At 6,000 yards, more of the ship's silhouette emerged, revealing the distinctive multi-level structure typical of Japanese heavy cruisers. This confirmation strengthened Hyde's resolve to proceed with the attack despite the risks. Hyde now needed to determine how close to approach before launching the torpedoes. Because the aft torpedo tubes were loaded with mines rather than torpedoes, Bergall could only attack using her 6 forward tubes. This constraint meant that Hyde had a single opportunity to conduct an effective attack. Firing from too far away increased the risk that the torpedoes would miss. Firing from too close reduced reaction time and exposed the submarine to a potentially lethal counterattack. Given these factors, Hyde chose to fire at approximately 3,000 yards, which was considered close for a surface attack against a warship. The choice reflected confidence in both the crew's ability to maintain stealth and the reliability of the Mark 23 torpedoes, which were improvements over earlier models that had suffered from multiple technical defects. Approaching the firing point required precise timing and careful handling. The submarine needed to maintain a steady course long enough to fire all 6 torpedoes, yet be ready to turn away immediately after launch. Hyde hoped that due to the positioning of the destroyer relative to the cruiser, the torpedo spread might strike both ships, or at least damage the escort enough to prevent effective pursuit. This was an ambitious calculation, but under the circumstances, any reduction in the escort's ability to counterattack would be advantageous. At approximately 20:37, Hyde ordered the launch of all 6 torpedoes from the forward tubes. The crew executed the order with practiced efficiency. The moment the 6th torpedo left the tube, Hyde ordered a turn away from the target to reduce the risk of being spotted or hit by return fire. The minutes that followed were tense. Torpedoes traveling at combat speed required a relatively short time to reach a target at 3,000 yards. But for the crew of a submarine awaiting the outcome, the interval could feel significantly longer. A massive explosion erupted on the target shortly after the torpedoes reached their predicted intercept point. The explosion illuminated the night sky, revealing flames and debris rising high above the ship. Hyde, observing the blast, believed multiple torpedoes had struck and possibly caused a catastrophic magazine detonation. The appearance of flames spreading across a long stretch of the ship suggested to him that the vessel might have been broken into separate burning sections. The impression of significant structural disintegration was convincing enough that Hyde considered the cruiser effectively destroyed. What he did not realize was that the torpedoes had struck Myōkō's already compromised stern, igniting fuel reserves and causing the rear section of the ship to separate or collapse dramatically, while leaving much of the forward structure intact. The immediate question following the explosion concerned the status of the escorting destroyer. Hyde observed that the escort had not begun pursuit, leading him to believe that it had also been hit or otherwise disabled. This interpretation shaped his next decision. Believing the cruiser destroyed and the destroyer immobilized, he ordered Bergall to turn back toward the site of the attack. His aim was to assess whether the escort could be finished off as well. This decision was made under the assumption of relative safety, but it underestimated both the resilience of the Japanese escort and the limitations imposed by the darkness, which obscured the destroyer's movements. As Bergall closed the distance once again, the escorting destroyer Ushio opened fire. The first rounds landed in Bergall's wake, missing narrowly. A second salvo found its mark. A shell pierced the submarine's forward deck, passed through the forward torpedo loading hatch, and continued through the hull without detonating. This was an extraordinarily fortunate outcome for Bergall, as an exploding shell inside the submarine's pressure hull would almost certainly have resulted in catastrophic loss of the vessel. Even without detonation, the shell inflicted serious damage to critical systems and rendered the submarine unable to submerge. Hyde was now confronted with a far more perilous situation than the one he had entered. He had a damaged submarine on the surface, dangerously close to enemy forces, and at risk of being discovered by aircraft at daylight. The decision to fight was over. The decision to survive was now paramount. The shell that struck USS Bergall during her attempted follow-up approach fundamentally altered the nature of the encounter. In the span of a few seconds, the submarine transitioned from an aggressive attacker pursuing a potentially decisive victory to a damaged vessel fighting for its own existence. Although the shell did not detonate, its passage through the hull caused a series of cascading failures. Steel plating around the entry and exit points was torn open, severing pipes and electrical conduits. The shock of the impact triggered electrical shorts and small fires that had to be extinguished rapidly. More critically, the breach in the pressure hull made diving impossible. A submarine unable to submerge in enemy waters was at immense risk, as even a single aircraft or patrol boat could attack it with no ability for the vessel to protect itself through evasion. With the forward torpedo room compromised and the submarine restricted to surface running, Commander Hyde ordered immediate withdrawal to the southwest, using the night's darkness to escape. Behind them, the Japanese escort Ushio, having fired the damaging salvo, did not pursue with full speed, partly due to her own mechanical limitations. The destroyer's remaining engine allowed her to reach a moderate speed, but she lacked the power needed to chase down a submarine retreating at maximum effort. Ushio's captain was also concerned by the uncertain condition of Myōkō, whose silhouette was still partially obscured by flames and smoke. Ushio needed to remain nearby to provide defensive support, damage control assistance, and navigational aid. This divided responsibility contributed to Bergall's chance to escape. While Bergall fled into the night, the situation aboard Myōkō was dire but not hopeless. The torpedo detonations had destroyed her stern, blown away the steering gear, ruptured the fantail structure, and ignited massive fires. Yet these forward sections of the ship were not flooded, and the crew immediately shifted to contain the fires spreading through the aft compartments. Japanese heavy cruisers of the Myōkō class had large, well-trained damage control teams accustomed to working under severe conditions. Their experience in previous engagements, including the cruiser's long service record in both the South Pacific and Indian Ocean, meant that Myōkō's crew responded quickly to the emergency. The explosion had caused substantial flooding, but watertight compartments forward of the damaged area held firm. Crews closed off bulkheads, deployed pumps, and attempted to smother the flames in the aft section. It took considerable time to bring the fires under control. Portions of the burning stern section continued to smolder through the night and into the next day. Despite the loss of her stern, Myōkō's forward propulsion systems remained functional. The ship's single remaining shaft provided limited propulsion, insufficient for maneuvering in battle or maintaining fleet speed, but adequate for slow, steady movement. Myōkō's ability to generate even minimal power was significant because it meant that she did not rely entirely on external towing throughout her long return to Singapore, though she required assistance for steering. The torpedo strike had drastically reduced Myōkō's hydrodynamic stability. Without the stern and effective rudder control, the ship was vulnerable to uncontrolled yawing, especially when waves interacted with the exposed aft bulkhead. Ushio's role therefore expanded beyond escort duties. At times she had to physically position herself along Myōkō's bow and nudge the cruiser into proper heading. This was a delicate maneuver requiring careful coordination to avoid collision damage. Japanese reports indicate that the destroyer's crew made repeated adjustments to keep Myōkō aligned with her intended course, sometimes spending prolonged periods steaming alongside or just ahead of her, signaling course corrections through light signals and maneuvers. While the Japanese ships focused on survival and containment, Bergall's situation demanded immediate damage control efforts. Hyde ordered his crew to evaluate the structural integrity of the forward compartments. The hull breach was patched using mattresses, timber, and whatever material could be quickly fitted to minimize seawater entry. Even though the patchwork was crude, it was sufficient to prevent waves from flooding the compartment as long as the submarine maintained favorable orientation relative to the swells. The electrical fires caused by severed cables were extinguished quickly, and surviving circuits were rerouted or repaired. Since the submarine could not submerge for the remainder of the journey, the crew assembled extra men-on-deck watches, prepared anti-aircraft guns, and heightened lookout vigilance. Hyde knew that the submarine's survival now depended largely on avoiding detection. The following morning, 14 December, brought a moment of considerable tension. A Japanese aircraft was sighted approaching the area where Bergall was making her escape. The submarine was unable to dive, and the smooth surface of the sea meant there was little opportunity to hide her wake. Hyde ordered evasive maneuvers designed to minimize visibility. Bergall angled toward cloud shadows and areas of disturbed sea created by shifting wind patterns. Fortuitously, the aircraft either failed to spot the submarine or chose to investigate another area. This narrow escape reinforced the precariousness of Bergall's position. An encounter with any aircraft capable of dropping bombs or depth charges would likely have ended the submarine's voyage. Hyde then transmitted a coded report summarizing the engagement and claiming the probable destruction of a Japanese heavy cruiser. The message was intentionally crafted to mislead any enemy listening to radio traffic, providing a false indication of Bergall's position and intended course. Maintaining radio silence was essential, but reporting a major sinking was a priority. After transmitting, Hyde resumed a southwestward course, aiming to reach safer waters near the approaches to Australia. As Bergall proceeded through the hazardous region, her crew continued to reinforce the temporary hull patches. The limited welding equipment aboard the submarine, a basic oxyacetylene kit, proved inadequate for long-term repair, and Hyde later criticized the lack of proper stock materials, plates, and welding tools. Nonetheless, the resourcefulness of the crew allowed Bergall to maintain enough structural integrity to withstand surface travel over thousands of miles. Meanwhile, Myōkō continued her slow transit back towards Singapore. Fires burned throughout 14 December, only being extinguished later that evening. The damaged cruiser moved at a speed of roughly 6 knots, limited by her remaining propulsion and the need for continuous course adjustments by Ushio. Japanese Naval Command, recognizing the severity of the situation, dispatched additional small craft, patrol boats, and minesweepers to assist the damaged cruiser and strengthen the escort. These vessels joined the formation on 15 and 16 December, providing limited towing assistance and further protection against submarine attack. The stormy weather that developed in the region hindered the movement of the Japanese formation, but had an unintended positive consequence. The same storms that slowed Myōkō and her auxiliaries provided concealment from the growing number of Allied submarines operating in the South China Sea. On 15 December, another key development occurred for Bergall. At around mid-morning, the submarine detected another contact on radar. Given the dangerous circumstances, this initially caused alarm, but the contact soon identified itself as USS Angler, an American Gato-class submarine operating in the same region. Communication was established, and Angler closed in to rendezvous. Hyde informed Angler's captain of the damage Bergall had sustained. The two submarines conducted a transfer of sensitive materials, including cryptographic documents, radar equipment, and some personal effects. This was a precautionary measure in case Bergall had to be scuttled to avoid capture. A plan was made for Angler to remain close behind Bergall during the journey, ready to receive evacuating crew members if a Japanese aircraft or ship appeared. This escort by submarine arrangement was unusual in U.S. Navy operations, but reflected the extraordinary vulnerability of Bergall's condition. Hyde prepared charges that could be detonated to destroy Bergall if abandonment became necessary. Angler maintained a discreet distance behind the damaged submarine, keeping clear of any potential surface searchers while staying close enough to intervene. Heavy cloud cover and periodic tropical squalls continued to obscure both submarines from aerial reconnaissance. As Myōkō and Ushio struggled northward, and Bergall and Angler made slow progress southward, both groups were now committed to survival rather than combat. The torpedo engagement had abruptly ended the tactical phase of the battle and shifted the focus to damage control, navigation, concealment, and the long, dangerous process of returning to friendly ports. Despite the destruction inflicted, all three ships remained afloat, setting up the next stages of their respective journeys, the long passage of Bergall through enemy waters, and the equally arduous return of Myōkō to Singapore. The engagement of 13 December had resulted not in a decisive sinking or a clear victory for either side, but in a complex aftermath that placed all three ships in precarious and highly unusual circumstances. Bergall had escaped immediate destruction from Ushio's gunfire, but was now in the worst state a submarine could be in during wartime, forced to remain entirely on the surface. Myōkō had survived the torpedo strikes, but had lost her stern, her steering ability, and much of her propulsion capacity. Ushio, though undamaged in this specific encounter, was already mechanically compromised and had to shoulder the responsibility of guiding a crippled cruiser through waters patrolled heavily by Allied submarines. The encounter did not end with the firing of torpedoes and shells. Instead, it initiated a prolonged and dangerous series of retreat efforts on both sides. USS Bergall's situation was immediately defined by the impossibility of diving. Submarines relied on submersion for both defensive and offensive action. Being unable to dive rendered Bergall essentially a small surface vessel with extremely limited armament, vulnerable to air attack, surface ships, and even minor enemy patrol craft. Hyde understood the gravity of this condition. He needed to determine a route that minimized contact with Japanese forces while still allowing the damaged submarine to reach a safe base. The closest friendly port capable of repairing Bergall was Fremantle, approximately 2,000 miles away. To reach it, Hyde had to navigate through roughly 1,200 miles of waters still within range of Japanese planes based in Indochina, Thailand, and the Dutch East Indies. Even in the best circumstances, this was a daunting distance for a submarine forced to remain surfaced throughout the journey. After patching the hull and completing initial emergency damage control, Bergall resumed her southwesterly course, relying heavily on night hours for movement in the most dangerous regions. Hyde synchronized the submarine's progress with periods of darkness, angling for cloud cover and remaining alert to any rise of the moon or break in the overcast that might increase visibility. Daylight hours were spent farther offshore or in weather conditions that could reduce the chance of being spotted from the air. The crew maintained constant surface lookouts, with anti-aircraft guns kept ready for rapid response. However, Hyde knew that if the Japanese aircraft spotted the submarine in daylight, there was little Bergall could do other than attempt sharp, evasive maneuvers and hope for poor visibility. During the morning of 14 December, just hours after the destroyer's shell had punched through the hull, a Japanese aircraft approached the region where Bergall was traveling. The exact model of the plane was not positively identified, but the sighting caused immediate alarm on the submarine. Hyde ordered a turn to port to slip into a shadowed area where the interplay of clouds and sea reflections provided partial concealment. The aircraft did not attack, or may not have seen Bergall at all. Either way, the close call confirmed the extreme vulnerability of the submarine's situation. Throughout the remainder of the day, the crew's focus intensified on lookout duties, as even a single reconnaissance plane could result in disaster. Hyde transmitted a report regarding the engagement with the cruiser, carefully masking Bergall's true position and future course. By providing misleading headings, he aimed to prevent Japanese forces from triangulating the submarine's movements. Radio silence was restored shortly thereafter, and Bergall continued her long retreat. The submarine made steady progress through the 14th and into the 15th, aided by the persistence of overcast skies. On 15 December, Bergall encountered an unexpected ally. Radar picked up another contact, initially a cause for concern, but the contact was soon identified as USS Angler, a fellow American submarine operating in the region. Communication was established, and Angler approached Bergall to offer aid. The meeting between two submarines at sea, especially one severely damaged, was a crucial moment. Angler's presence provided not only moral support, but also practical assistance that significantly increased Bergall's odds of survival. Hyde briefed Angler's captain on Bergall's condition, and both crews conducted a careful transfer of critical materials. Encryption manuals, sensitive documents, and some radar components were moved to Angler, ensuring that classified information would be safeguarded even if Bergall had to be abandoned. A plan was developed in which Angler would trail Bergall for the remainder of the voyage, ready to embark Bergall's crew on short notice. Hyde prepared scuttling charges that could be detonated to destroy Bergall if the submarine were in danger of capture, or if the hull breach worsened to the point where seaworthiness could not be maintained. This arrangement was highly unusual. American submarines rarely operated in escort formations because of communication restrictions and the need for stealth. However, the circumstances demanded a deviation from standard procedure, and Angler's assistance became a vital part of Bergall's slow escape toward Australia. Meanwhile, the situation aboard Myōkō remained challenging. The explosion caused by Bergall's torpedoes had severed the stern section, blown away the steering gear, and ignited fires that burned into the next day. Containing these fires was a major undertaking. Without a functioning stern, seawater entered the exposed aft areas much more easily, and the jagged remnants of the stern structure created numerous openings through which waves could cause further damage. Japanese reports indicate that the firefighting efforts continued throughout 14 December, with crew members working under heavy smoke to contain the blaze and stabilize the flooded compartments. The lack of full repair capacity in the region meant that Myōkō's crew could only conduct emergency-level responses rather than full restoration, but these efforts were sufficient to keep the ship afloat. Because Myōkō had lost her rudder, the ship was unable to steer independently. Her propulsion abilities were limited to a single working shaft. The result was a slow, largely uncontrollable trajectory. Ushio's role thus became essential. The destroyer did not have the towing power to pull Myōkō directly over long distances, but she could assist in directional adjustments. Using gentle nudging maneuvers, coordinated signaling, and small course corrections, Ushio kept Myōkō pointed toward Singapore. This required close proximity between the ships and constant vigilance to prevent collision. Further complicating matters was the weather. As storms developed in the region, wave action made it more difficult to maintain formation and increased the physical stress on both vessels. Japanese command recognized the need to reinforce the damaged formation and dispatched smaller vessels from regional ports to assist Myōkō. Minesweepers and small patrol boats reached the cruiser on 15 December and began to support the towing and escort duties. These auxiliaries were not equipped for high seas towing operations, but could help steady the cruiser's course and provide additional eyes against submarine threats. The increased escort did little to improve speed, however. Myōkō was limited to a pace of about 6 knots, and even this speed could not be maintained consistently due to weather and maneuvering needs. Nevertheless, the formation continued its slow journey southward towards Singapore. The storms that hindered the Japanese ships also worked in Bergall's favor. Heavy cloud cover and rougher seas reduced the chances of aerial detection and provided natural concealment. Angler remained behind Bergall throughout the 15th and 16th of December, maintaining silent coordination while Bergall pushed toward safer waters. At one point, American command sent orders instructing Angler to evacuate Bergall's crew and destroy the damaged submarine if conditions deteriorated further. Hyde, however, judged that Bergall remained capable of continuing under her own power, and feared that breaking radio silence to respond to the order might expose both submarines to Japanese detection. He therefore opted to continue the voyage without acknowledging the command. By 17 and 18 December, Bergall and Angler had passed through the most dangerous waters and were moving closer to the relatively safer approaches near northwestern Australia. Bergall's hull patches were holding, although water still seeped into some compartments. The constant motion of the submarine and spray from the sea put strain on the improvised repairs. The crew remained in a state of heightened alert, aware that even at this distance, an unexpected patrol or long-range aircraft could pose serious threats. Myōkō, on the other hand, endured a punishing trek northward. Fires were finally extinguished by the 15th, but the structural condition of the ship was precarious. Flooding in the aft sections remained a constant challenge, as the exposed rear bulkhead was repeatedly struck by waves. The damage control crews had to pump out incoming water continuously to maintain buoyancy. The Japanese formation's progress slowed further during the storms, but eventually, accompanied by Ushio and the auxiliary vessels, Myōkō reached the safety of Singapore on 25 December. By that time, the damage had been evaluated as irreparable with the resources available in the region. Japanese engineers concluded that the cruiser could not be made seaworthy for a return voyage to Japan. Instead, Myōkō was permanently moored and used as a stationary anti-aircraft battery for the remainder of the war. Bergall reached Exmouth Gulf on 20 December, where more substantial repairs were finally possible. After stabilizing the hull and repairing key systems, the submarine traveled under her own power to Fremantle, arriving on 23 December. The survival of the submarine under such circumstances was widely regarded as a testament to Hyde's leadership and the skill of the crew. The lengthy retreat demonstrated the resilience of the Bergall-class design, as well as the ingenuity of the sailors who kept Bergall afloat. With both damaged ships safely back in port, the immediate tactical phase of the encounter had concluded, yet the broader historical significance of the encounter and its implications for the late war naval situation would become clearer in the final analysis of their fates. The encounter between USS Bergall, IJN Myōkō, and IJN Ushio was an unusual event in the Pacific War, not because of the firepower exchanged or the level of destruction inflicted, but because, despite the violence of the engagement and the extreme vulnerability of each vessel afterward, all three ships survived. This is a rare outcome in submarine surface ship engagements, particularly at such close range and under such precarious conditions. The subsequent histories of these vessels and the circumstances of their survival offer insight into the broader naval environment in the final phase of the war and the adaptability of the crews on both sides. Following her arrival at Fremantle on 23 December 1944, USS Bergall underwent detailed inspection and more thorough repairs. The shell that had penetrated her hull had left behind a complex pattern of damage. The forward torpedo room required significant structural restoration, and the hull breach had to be reinforced with proper steel plating rather than the improvised patching used during the escape voyage. Electrical systems needed extensive rewiring due to the fires and shorts caused by the shell's passage. Hydraulics and ballast systems also required professional repair. Despite the severity of the damage, the submarine was considered worth repairing due to her relatively new age and overall operational value. Palau-class submarines were among the most advanced the U.S. Navy possessed, and repairing Bergall was consistent with wartime engineering priorities. Commander John M. Hyde was awarded the Navy Cross for his actions during the engagement and the subsequent rescue of his submarine. The award recognized not only the tactical execution of the attack, but also the leadership displayed during the long and dangerous retreat on the surface. His decisions to navigate under cloud cover, coordinate with USS Angler, prepare scuttling charges without abandoning the vessel prematurely, and maneuver to avoid aircraft detection demonstrated the type of resourcefulness and calm that the U.S. Navy valued highly in submarine commanders. Hyde continued his naval career, and Bergall returned to wartime service after repairs, participating in further patrols. After the war ended, Bergall's career did not end with decommissioning. Instead, like many U.S. submarines from the period, she was transferred to an Allied Navy. In 1958, Bergall was sold to Turkey, where she served under the name TCG Turgut Reis. The submarine remained in Turkish service for several decades, extending her operational life far beyond what might have been expected after the severe damage she suffered in 1944. She was finally retired in 1996 and scrapped in the year 2000. The longevity of Bergall's service, spanning over half a century, illustrates the durability of the Palau-class design and the quality of post-war maintenance programs among NATO allies. Myōkō, meanwhile, experienced a very different fate. When she arrived back in Singapore on 25 December 1944, Japanese engineers had to confront the reality that the ship was beyond repair. The removal of the stern and the extensive flooding of aft compartments left the ship structurally compromised. Her propulsion systems were incomplete, and her steering mechanisms were absent. With Japan facing acute shortages of skilled labor, steel, equipment, and fuel, a full reconstruction of the stern was impossible. Moreover, the strategic situation made deploying resources for the repair of a single cruiser impractical. Aircraft, escorts, and transports were already in short supply, and Japan's ability to maintain or replace major warships was essentially non-existent by early 1945. As a result, Myōkō was permanently moored in Singapore and repurposed as a stationary anti-aircraft battery. Her remaining guns, including her 8-inch main armament and various lighter anti-aircraft weapons, were used to defend the harbor against Allied air attacks. While she no longer had the mobility or tactical capabilities of an active cruiser, her guns continued to be of value in what had become a defensive theater. The ship thus became part of a broader pattern seen throughout the late war, in which heavily damaged Japanese vessels were converted into fixed anti-aircraft or coastal defense positions due to the impossibility of returning them to active service. British intelligence and naval planners took note of Myōkō's continued presence in Singapore. As the Allies devised plans to reoccupy the region, concerns emerged regarding the cruiser's capability to disrupt naval operations or provide artillery support against landing forces. In mid-1945, British forces considered using submarines or air attacks to eliminate the ship, fearing that her 8-inch guns might pose a significant threat if left intact. This culminated in at least one submarine attack directed toward the harbor area where Myōkō was moored, though the attacks did not succeed in destroying the cruiser. In the end, Myōkō survived the war intact despite having suffered catastrophic damage in December 1944. After Japan's formal surrender in September 1945, Myōkō, still immobile and heavily damaged, was handed over to British forces. She was inspected and deemed unsuitable for repurposing or repair, leading the British to tow her into deep water and scuttle her. This final action marked the end of a ship that had participated in nearly every major naval campaign of Japan's early wartime expansion and had endured some of the most intense naval battles of the Pacific conflict. Although she died not in combat but in post-war disposal, the cruiser's survival through years of sustained fighting and multiple torpedo strikes reflected both the resilience of Japanese naval engineering and the determination of her crews. Ushio, the destroyer escorting Myōkō during the December 1944 encounter, also survived the war. Among the Fubuki-class destroyers, Ushio was one of the few to endure the entire conflict. Following her participation in numerous battles, including the Pearl Harbor attack and the Aleutian campaign, Ushio reached the final months of the war in damaged condition but still operational. After assisting Myōkō's return to Singapore, she continued to serve in the region until the Japanese surrender. Ushio was formally surrendered to Allied forces in 1945 and was scrapped soon after, ending the service life of a ship that had witnessed nearly the full trajectory of the Imperial Japanese Navy's wartime rise and fall. The broader historical significance of the encounter between Bergall, Myōkō, and Ushio lies in the ways it encapsulated the evolving dynamics of the Pacific War during late 1944. By this stage, Japanese naval forces were no longer conducting major offensive operations. Their movements increasingly consisted of damaged ships retreating from battle, repositioning for repairs, or attempting to preserve surviving units for possible future engagements. The journey of Myōkō from Singapore toward Japan was typical of the logistical and operational struggles facing the remnants of Japan's fleet. The cruiser's inability to reach Japan for repairs reflected the collapse of the logistical infrastructure that had once supported the empire's far-flung naval operations. At the same time, the encounter highlighted the effectiveness and adaptability of American submarines. Bergall's attack on Myōkō demonstrated the ability of American submariners to exploit opportunities even in difficult conditions, such as shallow waters where submerged approaches were limited. The attack also showcased improvements in U.S. torpedo technology. Earlier in the war, torpedoes had been plagued by multiple defects, including faulty detonators and incorrect depth running. By late 1944, these issues had been largely resolved, and torpedoes like those fired by Bergall performed reliably, inflicting serious damage on one of Japan's major remaining cruisers. The post-attack experiences of both sides further highlight the importance of damage control, leadership, and improvisation. Bergall's escape over 2,000 miles of ocean while remaining on the surface was an extraordinary feat. Myōkō's survival, despite losing her stern and being immobilized, also reflected the skills of her crew and the structural resilience of the ship. The survival of all three vessels, Bergall, Myōkō, and Ushio, illustrates the unpredictability of naval warfare. It was entirely possible for both sides to believe they had delivered or received a fatal blow, only to discover later that the enemy, or themselves, had endured. The encounter also underscores how, by late 1944, the Pacific War was shaped not solely by decisive battles, but by countless smaller engagements, chance encounters, and individual tactical decisions. The outcome of the Bergall and Myōkō encounter did not shift the strategic balance of the war, but it served as a microcosm of the conditions that prevailed during the collapse of Japanese maritime power and the tightening of Allied control over the sea lanes. Taken together, the stories of these ships reflect the final phase of a long and destructive conflict. USS Bergall's survival and continued service, first in the U.S. Navy and later in the Turkish Navy, stand in contrast to the fate of Myōkō, which ended her life scuttled in post-war waters. Ushio's quiet surrender and dismantlement mirrored the dissolution of the Imperial Japanese Navy itself. The events of December 1944 remain an instructive example of how skill, timing, circumstance, and the resilience of crews determined outcomes at a time when the broader war was accelerating toward its end.